In the bustling streets of Port Harcourt, the Nwosu family lived in a cramped one-room apartment within the heart of the slum. Papa Nwosu, a former mechanic, had lost his job when his workshop was demolished by the government to make way for a new road. His wife Kelechi struggled to support the family by selling fried bean cake at the roadside. Their eldest child, Kelechi, a 22-year-old graduate, was jobless despite his degree, while their teenage daughter, Nneka, had a natural gift for art, but no means to pursue her passion. Life was a constant struggle for the Nwosus, who survived each day by scraping together whatever little they could. Their meals often consisted of the simplest ingredients, and even then, there were days when the pot stayed empty. Still, hope remained their only refuge, though it was wearing thin. Kelechi, frustrated by his circumstances, often dreamed of a better life. One day, an opportunity arose that would change everything for the family. Kelechi learned that a wealthy family, the Obidikes, was looking for a tutor for their son. The chance to enter the world of Port Harcourt's elite seemed like the break he needed. The Obidike family lived in the affluent GRA district, far removed from the poverty that Kelechi and his family knew too well. Kelechi had heard about the job opening from a friend who worked as a houseboy in one of the mansions nearby. The Obidikes needed a tutor for their son, Chima, and Kelechi, though he had never been a tutor before, saw this as his chance to make a mark. His education, though underutilized, could now be his ticket into a life of comfort. Or so he thought. That evening, over a dinner of boiled yam and palm oil, Kelechi shared the news with his family. Papa Nwosu, ever the optimist, beamed with pride. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. But Kelechi, ever the realist, was more skeptical. "These rich people don't see us as equals, Kelechi," she warned. "Be careful with them." Still, the family agreed that Kelechi should apply for the job. It was a chance they couldn't afford to pass up, and Kelechi was determined to seize it. The next day, Kelechi dressed in his best clothes, an old shirt and trousers that had seen better days, and made his way to the Obidike mansion. The air in GRA was different. It smelled of freshly cut grass and wealth. As he approached the gate, the sheer size of the house overwhelmed him. The high walls, security cameras, and neatly trimmed hedges all told him that this was a world far removed from his own. The gatekeeper looked him over with suspicion, but let him in after confirming his appointment. As Kelechi walked through the sprawling compound, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in such comfort. When he finally met Mr. Obidike, the man was as imposing as his house, tall, stern, and exuding authority. "So, you want to tutor my son?" Mr. Obidike asked, his eyes cold. Kelechi nodded, unsure of how this would go. But he knew one thing. This was his chance, and he wouldn't let it slip away. Kelechi passed the interview, though he wasn't sure how. Maybe it was the desperation in his eyes, or the fact that Mr. Obidike didn't care much for the details, but Kelechi was hired as Chima's tutor. It wasn't long before Kelechi realized that Chima, a spoiled 16-year-old, wasn't interested in learning. His grades weren't important to him, and he spent most of his time glued to his phone. But Kelechi had a bigger plan in mind. He couldn't simply be a tutor, and nothing more. He needed to find a way to get his entire family involved in the Obidike household. During one of their lessons, Chima complained about the family driver, saying he was old and slow. This sparked an idea in Kelechi's mind. That night, he told his father about it. "Papa, what if you became their driver?" Kelechi suggested. Papa Nwosu hesitated, but the possibility of a steady income was too tempting to ignore. Kelechi devised a plan to get Papa Nwosu the job. He would subtly suggest to Chima that the family needed a new driver, someone younger, more energetic. The next day during their lesson, Kelechi planted the seed. You know, my father used to be a driver for a wealthy businessman before his shop was demolished, Kelechi said casually. Chima, already bored with their lesson, perked up at the idea. It didn't take long for Chima to complain to his parents about the old driver. And soon enough, Papa Nwosu was called in for an interview. With Kelechi's help, they made sure he presented himself as the perfect candidate. Papa Nwosu got the job. The Nwosu family was slowly infiltrating the Obidike household, one position at a time. The first victory brought a flicker of hope back into their home. But as they celebrated, Kelechi knew this was only the beginning. With Papa Nwosu now working as the Obidike family driver, the Nwosus started to feel a sense of hope they hadn't experienced in a long time. The extra money from his job helped, but it wasn't enough to lift them completely out of poverty. Kelechi knew they needed to go further. Nkechi and Nneka still had no real income, and that was a problem. One evening, as they sat together eating a modest dinner, Kelechi shared his next plan. "Mama, I think there's a way for you to get into the Obidike household too," Kelechi said thoughtfully. "Their housekeeper is old, and I've heard Mrs. Obidike complain about her being slow." Nkechi was hesitant, but Kelechi convinced her that it was worth a try. They had come too far to stop now. Kelechi played his cards carefully. During one of his tutoring sessions with Chima, he subtly mentioned that his mother used to be a housekeeper for a wealthy family before circumstances forced her out of the job. Chima, always quick to relay complaints, casually brought it up with his mother. Mrs. Obidike, always eager for efficiency, took the bait. Nkechi was invited for an interview, and with Kelechi's guidance, she presented herself as the ideal replacement for the aging housekeeper. It wasn't long before she, too, was employed in the Obidike household. The family was overjoyed. They were finally seeing some light at the end of their dark tunnel. But Kelechi wasn't done yet. There was still one more person to bring in. Nneka had been quietly observing the changes around her. She was talented, especially when it came to drawing, but she hadn't yet found her place in the grand plan Kelechi had orchestrated. That changed when Kelechi overheard Mrs. Obidike talking about finding an art therapist for her younger child, Adaora, who had been having difficulty expressing herself. Kelechi saw the opportunity immediately. "Nneka, this is your chance," he told her excitedly. He knew Nneka had never been an art therapist, but that didn't matter. All she needed to do was convince the Obidikes that she could help Adaora. With some coaching from Kelechi, Nneka presented herself as an art therapist, and just like that, she became the latest addition to the Obidike household. The Nwosus were now fully embedded in the lives of the wealthy family. As the weeks went by, the Nwosus settled into their new roles. Kelechi continued tutoring Chima, though the boy showed little interest in his studies. Papa Nwosu was driving Mr. Obidike to business meetings and social events, while Nkechi kept the house running smoothly. Nneka, surprisingly, was doing well with Adaora, using her natural artistic talent to connect with the child. But Kelechi knew their success was built on a fragile foundation. If anyone found out that they were all related and had schemed their way into these jobs, the consequences would be devastating. The pressure of keeping their secret weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to make it work. After all, this was their only shot at escaping the life of poverty they had known for so long. The Nwosus' new life was going smoothly, until the old housekeeper, Mrs. Etim, showed up unexpectedly one afternoon. She had been dismissed quietly when Nkechi took her place, but no one expected her to return. Mrs. Etim was not only angry about losing her job, but she was also suspicious. She had worked for the Obidikes for years, and something about Nkechi and the Nwosu family didn't sit right with her. As she stood at the gate, demanding to see Mrs. Obidike, the Nwosu family's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Kelechi watched from the window, his heart pounding. He knew that if Mrs. Etim started asking too many questions, their secret could unravel. What would happen next could determine whether they continued their climb or fell back into the depths of poverty. Mrs. Etim's voice grew louder as she argued with the gatekeeper, demanding to see Mrs. Obidike. Kelechi, who had been cleaning inside, froze when she heard the familiar voice. Panic set in. If Mrs. Etim managed to talk to Mrs. Obidike, everything they had built could come crashing down. Kelechi rushed to the gate, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. "I'm sorry, madam, but Mrs. Obidike is not available right now," Kelechi said politely, trying to keep his voice steady. Mrs. Etim shot him a suspicious look. "Who are you?" she asked sharply. Kelechi introduced himself as the tutor, but Mrs. Etim wasn't convinced. "I know something is going on here," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I'll be back, and when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." After Mrs. Etim's departure, the Nwosu family gathered in their small apartment, the air thick with tension. Kelechi was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she wiped her face with her wrapper. "What if she comes back? What if she finds out?" she asked, her voice cracking. Kelechi, though equally worried, tried to stay calm. "We just have to be careful," he said. "As long as we don't give her any reason to be suspicious, we'll be fine." But the fear of exposure hung over them like a cloud. Neka, who had been growing more comfortable in her role as Adaora's art therapist, now felt uneasy. "Maybe we should stop this," she suggested quietly. "We've already come this far," Kelechi replied firmly. "We can't turn back now. We just have to be smart about it." Kelechi knew they couldn't just sit and wait for Mrs. Etim to return. He needed to stay ahead of her. That night, as the family sat together in their small apartment, Kelechi came up with a plan. "We have to make sure the Obidikes trust us completely," he said. "If they trust us, then no one, especially not Mrs. Etim, will be able to plant doubt in their minds." Papa Nwosu nodded in agreement, but Kelechi still looked uneasy. "How do we do that?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Kelechi's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. "We'll need to get closer to them, make ourselves indispensable. We need to become more than just their staff. We need to become like family." It was a bold idea, but Kelechi knew it was their only chance. Over the next few weeks, Kelechi and his family worked hard to implement the plan. Kelechi went above and beyond her duties as the housekeeper, anticipating Mrs. Obidike's needs before she even expressed them. Neka's sessions with Adaora became more personal as she bonded with the young girl through their shared love of art. Meanwhile, Papa Nwosu ensured that Mr. Obidike could always rely on him, being available for any late-night errands or last-minute trips. Kelechi, too, took steps to deepen his connection with Chima. Though the boy remained uninterested in his studies, Kelechi found other ways to gain his trust, offering advice on personal matters, and even becoming something of an older brother figure to him. Slowly, the Obidikes began to view the Nwosu family not just as employees, but as people they could trust. It seemed like the plan was working. Just as things seemed to be falling into place, Mrs. Etim returned. This time, she wasn't at the gate. She had found her way back into the Obidike mansion, claiming she had left some personal items behind. Kelechi's heart sank when he saw her standing in the kitchen, chatting with Kelechi. Mrs. Etim's eyes narrowed when she saw him. "So, you're still here," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. Kelechi forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "Yes, madam. I'm still here," he replied. He knew Mrs. Etim was trying to find any excuse to dig up dirt on them, but he couldn't let her win. For the next few hours, she moved through the house, looking for any evidence that the Nwosu family had deceived the Obidikes. Kelechi watched her like a hawk, ready to intervene if necessary. As Mrs. Etem searched the house, Kelechi couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to discovering their secret. His mind raced with thoughts of how to stop her. Finally, she approached Mrs. Obidike, claiming that Nkechi was hiding something. Kelechi's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Mrs. Obidike's reaction. But to his surprise, Mrs. Obidike dismissed Mrs. Etem's concerns. "Nkechi has been nothing but helpful to me," she said with a wave of her hand. "You're just upset because she took your job. I suggest you move on." Mrs. Etem's face flushed with anger, but she knew she had been defeated. Without another word, she stormed out of the house, leaving the Nwosu family to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Though Mrs. Etem was gone for now, the tension in the household remained. Kelechi knew that it was only a matter of time before something else threatened their fragile position. As the days passed, the stress began to take a toll on the family. Nkechi became more nervous, constantly worrying about making a mistake. Neka, too, started to feel the pressure, and her sessions with Adaora became strained. Kelechi, who had been the mastermind behind their plan, felt the weight of the family's future on his shoulders. He couldn't let them down. But the cracks were starting to show, and he knew they needed to keep it together if they wanted to succeed. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. Despite the tension, one thing became clear: Neka's bond with Adaora was growing stronger. Adaora, who had been a quiet and withdrawn child, began to open up to Neka in ways she never had with anyone else. She shared her fears, her dreams, and her frustrations, and Neka listened patiently, offering comfort through their art sessions. Mrs. Obidike noticed the change in her daughter and was impressed. "You've done wonders with her, Neka," she said one afternoon. "I haven't seen Adaora this happy in years." Neka smiled, grateful for the praise, but inside she felt conflicted. She knew that their entire relationship was built on a lie. Could she really continue to deceive a family that had come to trust her so much? One evening, after another successful art therapy session, Mrs. Obidike made Neka an unexpected offer. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone serious. "You've been such a great help with Adaora, and I want to offer you something more permanent. How would you feel about becoming Adaora's full-time caregiver?" Neka was stunned. This was a huge opportunity, but it also meant deepening her involvement in the deception. She couldn't refuse the offer. It was too good to pass up, but the weight of their lies felt heavier than ever. "Thank you, ma'am," Neka said, forcing a smile. "I'd be honored." Inside, she wondered how long they could continue this charade before it all came crashing down. While Neka's bond with Adaora grew, Chima's attitude toward Kelechi began to change. The teenage boy, once indifferent and carefree, started acting distant and suspicious. Kelechi noticed the shift and couldn't help but feel uneasy. Had Chima figured something out? Was he starting to question the Nwosu family's presence in his home? Chima's coldness was subtle at first: missed tutoring sessions, short replies, and a lack of eye contact. But soon, Kelechi realized that Chima was avoiding him altogether. Kelechi's mind raced with possibilities. If Chima started asking too many questions, he could ruin everything. Kelechi knew he needed to find a way to regain Chima's trust before it was too late. Determined to fix things, Kelechi decided to confront Chima directly. One afternoon, he found the boy lounging in the garden, scrolling through his phone. "Chima, is something bothering you?" Kelechi asked, trying to sound casual. Chima glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Why are you really here?" he asked bluntly. Kelechi's heart skipped a beat. Chima was more perceptive than he had given him credit for. Kelechi had to think quickly. "I'm here because I want to help," he said, choosing his words carefully. "You're smart, Chima. You just need someone to push you in the right direction." Chima didn't respond right away, but Kelechi could see the boy was thinking. Kelechi hoped his words had bought them some time. Despite Kelechi's efforts, the tension between him and Chima persisted. Kelechi could feel the boy's suspicion growing, and it unnerved him. He had worked so hard to gain the family's trust, but now it seemed like everything was hanging by a thread. He couldn't shake the feeling that Chima was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. At the same time, Nkechi's nerves were fraying. She had been extra careful around Mrs. Obidike, but the constant pressure of keeping up the act was wearing her down. She confided in Kelechi, her voice shaky with worry. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted. "What if they find out?" Kelechi reassured her, but deep down, he shared her fears. They were playing a dangerous game, and they all knew it. Just as the Nwosu family thought they had their plan under control, a new threat emerged. Mr. Obidike had hired a private investigator to look into some of his business dealings. The man, Mr. Anayo, was thorough and suspicious by nature. When he visited the Obidike mansion for the first time, he immediately noticed something strange about the Nwosu family. Their presence didn't quite fit with the wealthy, structured life of the Obidikes. Kelechi sensed the danger as soon as he saw Mr. Anayo. The investigator's sharp eyes missed nothing, and Kelechi felt like the man was scrutinizing every move they made. "Who is this man?" Kelechi asked Nkechi later that evening. "He's not one of the usual visitors." Nkechi shrugged, but Kelechi's instincts told him this man could unravel everything they had worked for. Mr. Anayo began to spend more time around the mansion, and his presence unsettled the entire Nwosu family. He wasn't just looking into Mr. Obidike's business dealings. He seemed to be paying attention to everything, including the household staff. Kelechi did his best to stay out of the man's way, but he knew that wasn't enough. If Mr. Anayo started digging into their backgrounds, he could uncover the truth. One evening, Kelechi overheard a conversation between Mr. Anayo and Mr. Obidike. "Your household staff seems new," Mr. Anayo remarked. "Have you looked into their backgrounds?" Mr. Obidike waved off the question. "They're fine. They've been with us for a while now." But Mr. Anayo didn't seem convinced. Kelechi's heart raced. If Mr. Anayo decided to investigate further, their lies would be exposed. Realizing the danger, Kelechi decided they needed to act quickly before Mr. Anayo could dig any deeper. He approached his family with a plan. "We need to make it impossible for Mr. Anayo to look into our backgrounds," he said. "We need to distract him, make him focus on something else." Nkechi was hesitant, but Kelechi insisted. "If we don't do this, everything will fall apart," he said. "We need to protect ourselves." They agreed to stage a situation that would divert Mr. Anayo's attention away from them. Kelechi knew it was a risky move, but they were running out of options. The stakes were higher than ever. The Nwosu family executed their plan to divert Mr. Anayo's attention. Kelechi carefully orchestrated a scene where one of Mr. Obidike's closest business associates was implicated in a small scandal. It involved falsified documents, something minor but enough to stir some suspicion. Kelechi planted the information subtly, ensuring it would catch Mr. Anayo's eye without implicating themselves. Mr. Anayo took the bait. Within days, his attention was fully on the businessman, leaving the Nwosu family some breathing room. Kelechi breathed a sigh of relief, but deep down, he knew this was only a temporary fix. They couldn't afford to relax, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. Nkechi, Neka, and Papa Nwosu also felt the tension ease, but the weight of their deception still lingered. As the weeks passed, Neka's bond with Adaora deepened, but so did her guilt. She had become like a sister to the young girl, helping her express herself through art and spending long hours together. Adaora looked up to Neka and trusted her completely, which made the lie that much harder to bear. One day, As they sat in the garden painting together, Adaora asked, "Neka, will you always be here with me?" The question caught Neka off guard. She forced a smile and replied, "Of course, Adaora." But the words felt heavy in her mouth. Neka didn't know how much longer they could maintain their lie, and the thought of hurting Adaora weighed heavily on her heart. Despite Kelechi's efforts to repair his relationship with Chima, the boy remained distant. In fact, Chima had begun conducting his own investigation. He didn't trust Kelechi or the rest of the Nwosu family, and his curiosity got the better of him. Chima started asking around about Kelechi and his family, questioning the staff and digging into their backgrounds. One afternoon, Chima approached one of the older staff members who had been with the Obidikes for years. "Have you ever heard of this Kelechi before he started working here?" Chima asked casually. The staff member shook his head. "No, he's new. Why do you ask?" Chima's suspicions grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and he was determined to find out what it was. Just as the Nwosu family thought they had some control over the situation, fate took an unexpected turn. Nkechi fell ill. It started as a minor cough, but within days, she was bedridden with a high fever. Kelechi, Neka, and Papa Nwosu were frantic. Without Nkechi working in the Obidike household, their plan could unravel. Nkechi insisted she would recover soon, but her condition only worsened. Kelechi was torn between taking care of his mother and maintaining their positions at the Obidike home. "We can't let them see her like this," Kelechi warned the family. "If they start asking questions, we're finished." The stress mounted, and Kelechi began to fear that their luck had finally run out. As Nkechi's illness worsened, Neka knew she had to step up. She began taking on more of her mother's duties around the Obidike household, cleaning and managing the day-to-day tasks that Nkechi would normally handle. It wasn't easy, especially with her responsibilities to Adaora, but Neka couldn't let the family's plan fall apart. Mrs. Obidike noticed Neka's hard work and praised her for it, unaware of the true reason behind it. "You're such a diligent young woman, Neka. Your mother must be proud," she said one evening. Neka forced a smile, her heart heavy with guilt. She was doing everything she could to keep their secret safe, but the weight of the deception was becoming unbearable. Chima's investigation into the Nwosu family finally led him to a breakthrough. After weeks of digging, he uncovered something shocking. The Nwosus were not who they claimed to be. Chima found evidence that the Nwosu family had lied about their qualifications and backgrounds to infiltrate the Obidike household. Armed with this information, Chima confronted Kelechi one afternoon. "I know who you really are," Chima said, his voice cold. Kelechi's heart sank, but he tried to play it off. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, but Chima wasn't fooled. "You've been lying to us this whole time," Chima continued. "I don't know why, but I'm going to find out." Kelechi knew that Chima's discovery could destroy everything. That night, he gathered the family to discuss their next move. "Chima knows," Kelechi said, his voice heavy with dread. Nkechi, still weak from her illness, looked horrified. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to get ahead of this," Kelechi replied. "We need to make sure Chima doesn't have the chance to tell his parents. If we can convince him to stay quiet, we might still have a chance." The family was desperate, but they knew that Chima was their biggest threat. Kelechi had no choice but to confront him directly and hope for the best. The next day, Kelechi approached Chima with a desperate plea. "I know you've found out the truth, Chima," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "But I'm asking you to keep this between us. My family, we didn't have a choice. We're just trying to survive." Chima looked at him, his expression unreadable. You've been lying to my family for months, Chima replied. Why should I trust you? Kelechi took a deep breath. Because if you expose us, everything will fall apart. My family will lose everything. I'm asking you for mercy, Chima. Please. There was a long silence as Chima considered his words. Finally, Chima spoke. I'll think about it, he said. It wasn't a promise, but it was the only hope Kelechi had left. As days passed without any word from Chima, the Nwosu family lived in a constant state of fear. Every knock on the door, every phone call, sent waves of anxiety through them. They couldn't predict what Chima would do, and the uncertainty was eating them alive. And Kelechi, though still recovering, couldn't help but feel guilty for putting her family in this position. Maybe we should just leave, she suggested one evening. We can start over somewhere else. But Kelechi was determined to see their plan through. If we run now, everything we've done will be for nothing, he said. We have to stay strong. Yet deep down, even Kelechi knew they were running out of time. Chima held their fate in his hands, and there was nothing they could do but wait. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Chima made his decision. He approached Kelechi during one of their tutoring sessions, his expression serious. I've thought about what you said, Chima began. Kelechi held his breath, waiting for the boy's verdict. I won't tell my parents, at least not yet, Chima continued, but I want something in return. Kelechi was relieved, but cautious. What do you want? He asked. Chima smirked. I want you to help me. If I'm going to keep your secret, you're going to help me get out of this house. I don't want to be stuck under my parents' control anymore. Kelechi agreed, knowing that he didn't have a choice. Chima's demand was the price of their continued survival. With Chima on their side, the Nwosu family had a temporary reprieve, but their situation was far from stable. Chima's new demand meant that Kelechi had to help him escape the confines of his privileged life, which was no easy task. Chima's rebellious streak had always been there, but now he wanted freedom from his parents and their expectations. Kelechi and Chima began working together to come up with a plan. Chima's ultimate goal was to leave home and pursue his own path, free from the pressure of his family's wealth and influence. Kelechi found himself in a delicate balancing act. He had to keep Chima's trust while ensuring that their secret remained safe. While Kelechi and Chima plotted, Nneka experienced a breakthrough with Adaora. The young girl had always been quiet and reserved, but now she was opening up in ways that no one had expected. Adaora revealed deep feelings of loneliness and isolation despite her family's wealth. She felt misunderstood, and Nneka became her only source of comfort. One afternoon, as they painted together, Adaora confided in Nneka. I don't feel like I belong here, she said softly. Everyone expects me to be someone I'm not. Nneka listened, her heart aching for the girl. Adaora's words reminded her of her own family's struggles, of how they had never fit into the world of the wealthy. At that moment, Nneka realized just how similar they really were. Chima's desire to escape his family's control grew stronger by the day. He began talking about leaving Port Harcourt altogether, finding a way to start fresh in another city. Kelechi tried to keep him grounded, warning him that running away wouldn't be as easy as he thought. You're used to this life, Chima, Kelechi reminded him. Out there, it's different. You can't just walk away from everything. But Chima was determined. He saw Kelechi's life as an example of what he wanted: freedom, independence, and the ability to make his own choices. What Chima didn't realize was that Kelechi's life was far from ideal. The struggle for survival wasn't something Chima could truly understand. Still, Kelechi agreed to help Chima find a way out, knowing that his own survival depended on it. As Kelechi and Chima worked together, a hidden truth began to emerge. Mr. Obidike had secrets of his own, secrets that threatened to unravel everything. Kelechi stumbled upon financial records that hinted at corruption and illegal dealings within Mr. Obidike's business empire. The discovery shocked Kelechi. It seemed that the Obidikes weren't as perfect as they appeared. Kelechi debated what to do with the information. On one hand, he could use it to secure his family's position in the household. On the other, exposing Mr. Obidike's wrongdoings could bring the entire family down, including the Nwosus. It was a dangerous game, and Kelechi wasn't sure if he was ready to play it. Kelechi kept the information about Mr. Obidike's corruption to himself, but it weighed heavily on his mind. Should he use it as leverage to protect his family, or was the risk too great? As he wrestled with his decision, the tension in the Obidike household continued to rise. Chima's growing rebellion and Adaora's emotional struggles were taking their toll on the family. Mrs. Obidike, sensing that something was wrong, confided in Nkechi one evening. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice strained. "Everything feels like it's falling apart." Nkechi listened sympathetically, but inside, she felt a sense of dread. The lies were becoming too heavy to carry, and it seemed like their carefully constructed world was on the verge of collapse. Things came to a head when Mr. Anayo, the private investigator, returned to the mansion. He had never fully stopped his investigations, and now he had new information that threatened to expose both the Nwosu family and Mr. Obidike. Mr. Anayo confronted Mr. Obidike with evidence of his financial misdeeds, and the Obidike family was thrown into chaos. As the Obidikes scrambled to contain the situation, Kelechi realized that their time was running out. If Mr. Anayo continued digging, it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the Nwosu family's lies. Kelechi had to act fast, but the question was, what could he do to stop the inevitable? Kelechi knew that their situation had reached a critical point. He gathered his family and laid out the harsh truth. "We have two choices," he said grimly. "We can leave now and try to disappear before everything falls apart, or we can stay and risk being exposed." Nkechi, still recovering from her illness, looked exhausted. "We can't run forever, Kelechi," she said softly. Neka too felt torn. She had grown attached to Adaora, and the thought of leaving her behind felt unbearable. "What if we tell the truth?" Neka suggested. "Maybe if we explain everything, they'll understand." But Kelechi knew that the truth would only lead to their downfall. The Obidikes wouldn't forgive such a betrayal, no matter how much they had come to trust them. Just as the Nwosu family was trying to decide their next move, Chima made a decision of his own. Frustrated by his parents and feeling trapped in his life, Chima took matters into his own hands. He exposed his father's corruption to the press, sparking a scandal that rocked the entire city of Port Harcourt. Chima's betrayal sent shockwaves through the Obidike household. Mr. Obidike's empire began to crumble, and the family was thrown into disarray. But Chima's actions also had unintended consequences. With the media now focused on the Obidikes, it wasn't long before they began looking into everyone connected to the family, including the Nwosu family. As the media storm surrounding the Obidikes grew, the Nwosu family's lies began to unravel. Reporters and investigators started asking questions, digging into the backgrounds of everyone working for the Obidikes. It wasn't long before the truth about the Nwosu family came to light. They had infiltrated the Obidike household under pretenses, and now their deception was exposed for all to see. The Obidikes were furious. Mrs. Obidike felt personally betrayed by Nkechi, whom she had come to trust. Adaora was devastated when she learned that Neka had been lying to her the entire time. And Mr. Obidike, already reeling from his own scandal, demanded that the Nwosu family leave immediately. the Nwosu family left the Obidike mansion in disgrace. Their dream of escaping poverty had come crashing down, and they were left with nothing. As they returned to their small apartment, the weight of their failure hung heavily over them. Kelechi felt responsible for everything. He had been the one to lead his family into this deception, and now they were paying the price. Nkechi too felt the sting of betrayal. She had trusted in Kelechi's plan, but now all she could think about was how they had hurt the people who had trusted them. Nneka, who had grown so close to Adaora, was heartbroken. She had never meant to hurt the young girl, but now she could never face her again. In the weeks that followed, the Nwosu family struggled to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Papa Nwosu returned to driving taxis, while Nkechi went back to selling akara on the roadside. Kelechi searched for work, but found that their scandal had followed them, making it difficult to find a job. Nneka too tried to move on, but the guilt of what they had done weighed heavily on her. Despite everything, the family knew they had to keep going. They had faced hardship before, and they would face it again. But this time, they would do it with honesty. Kelechi made a vow to himself that he would never again lead his family down a path of lies and deception. It wasn't worth the pain they had caused, both to themselves and to others. One day, while walking through the city, Kelechi ran into Chima. The two locked eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. Chima had left the Obidike household after exposing his father's corruption, now living on his own. He looked different, humbled, but also free. "I didn't expect to see you here," Chima said, breaking the silence. Kelechi nodded. "I didn't expect to see you either." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Chima spoke again. "I never meant for things to turn out this way," he said quietly. "I was just trying to escape." Kelechi understood. They had both been trying to escape. Chima from his family's control, and Kelechi from the crushing weight of poverty. But in the end, they had both learned that escape wasn't so simple. Despite everything that had happened, Kelechi found himself forgiving Chima. They had both made mistakes, but they had also both paid the price. "It's not easy," Kelechi said, "but we have to move forward. We can't keep running from our mistakes." Chima nodded, and for the first time, there was a sense of understanding between them. As they parted ways, Kelechi felt a sense of closure. The Obidikes were no longer a part of his life, and the Nwosu family would have to rebuild from scratch. But Kelechi knew that they could do it. They had survived this long, and they would survive again, this time with the lessons they had learned guiding them. Months passed, and slowly the Nwosu family began to rebuild their lives. It wasn't easy, but they were determined to do things the right way this time. Nkechi found a job as a housekeeper for a small family, and Papa Nwosu managed to save enough money to start a small business. Kelechi continued to search for work, but he remained hopeful that something would come through. Nneka too began to heal. She started teaching art classes at a local community center, helping other children express themselves through creativity. Though she still thought of Adaora often, she knew that their paths had diverged, and she hoped that the young girl would find her own way. In the end, the Nwosu family learned that there were no shortcuts in life. They had tried to escape their circumstances through lies and deception, but it had only led to pain and heartbreak. Now, they faced the future with a new sense of purpose and determination. They would continue to fight for a better life, but this time they would do it with honesty and integrity. As they sat together in their small apartment sharing a simple meal, Kelechi looked around at his family. They had been through so much, but they had survived. And in that survival, they had found something even more valuable than wealth, a sense of unity and strength that no amount of money could buy. The Nwosu family would rise again, but this time they would do it the right way. This story of the Nwosu family shows that while ambition and the desire to escape hardship are admirable, choosing the path of deceit only leads to destruction and heartbreak. Trust and integrity are essential in building lasting success, and there are no shortcuts to a better life. The Nwosus ultimately learned that honesty, perseverance, and unity within the family are far more valuable than wealth gained through deception. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed this tale and took away some important lessons from it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you learn from the Nwosu family's journey? Please leave a comment below and let us know. Your feedback means a lot to us. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more captivating African stories. See you in the next video.